Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. I didn't think I was live there, but I am. My screen looked a little different tonight for some reason. Welcome. My name is Karey Carbaugh, and this is the Karey Carbaugh podcast. If you will allow me for a moment, I would like to welcome some of my Spanish-speaking friends that have been interacting with some of these podcasts, some of them live and some of them on the replay. These are people that I've met on various mission trips to Mexico, so I'd like to welcome them in for a moment. Buenas tardes, o buenas noches, morros y damas, morros y caballeros, chicos y chicas, niños de todas edades. Yo soy Karey Carbaugh y este es el Karey Carbaugh podcast. Bienvenidos. Once again, welcome to everyone, both Spanish-speaking and English-speaking. I can't tell you over the last few weeks that I've been doing these how blessed I've felt with the interactions that I've been getting, the responses I've been getting from people. And I just would welcome you in tonight and would encourage you, if you're watching this live, if you could put a live in the comments. If you're watching this on the replay, put an R or replay to let me know whether you're watching this live or on the replay. As usual, I'm not going to try to respond to comments. I'm still pretty new to this and not quite comfortable enough to start doing live comment responses yet. But if you have questions about anything that I cover tonight, please do put them in the comments and I will respond to them. If you have suggestions for future podcasts, please put those as well. If you have questions that you'd like me to address on one of my future podcasts, I would welcome those. Tonight's podcast, I'm going to be a bit vulnerable here and share a bit more of my personal testimony, going back to my childhood. Tonight's podcast is all about growing up as a person with low vision. Last week we talked about don't be afraid of a person with low vision, and I gave some background as to my vision limitations and some details on that. Tonight I wanted to basically start, I'm going to try and do this somewhat chronologically, as I was growing up with a low vision. So when I was about 4 years old, my parents learned that I had a vision disability. One might wonder why they didn't realize that until I was 4. Well, as an infant, I had a disease called hydrocephalus, which is basically water on the brain, and they performed a surgery that basically saved my life. And so up until that point, my parents were far more concerned on survival, really. So when I was 4, or about 4 years old, I was getting tall enough that I started bumping into tabletops and things that, as I was walking around, that maybe I had avoided or been able to miss up until that point. So they found out when I was about 4 years old that I had low vision, and the doctors basically told my parents to put me in an institution, send me to the state school, and forget about me. My dad's response was pretty much over my dead body would he send his 4-year-old to live in an institution. Unfortunately, at that time, there were no programs in the schools here locally, in Longmont, Colorado, where I live. There were no programs for people with vision disabilities or people with low vision. So they had basically decided if they needed to, they would move to a nearby city of Greeley, where my father worked. But they put me in kindergarten with no special programs. The teacher, when I was in kindergarten, spent extra time with me, and my mother was a volunteer working with some of the other children so that the teacher could spend more time with me. I didn't learn a lot of this until I was in high school, actually, when I was doing some of the research for the speech that I mentioned last week, which was titled, Don't Be Afraid of a Handicapped Person. And in doing some of the research for that speech, I learned a lot of what I'm going to share with you tonight from my parents' perspective. So I started kindergarten with no special program. And about halfway through the year, the school district contacted my parents and said, okay, we found the funding. What kind of a program would you like? And my dad said, I don't know. You're the educators. I want a good one. And I say my dad, it was really both of my parents that were in agreement and involved in this. My recollection is that my dad was the one who did more of the advocating or the pushing. They were both advocates for sure. My mother ended up working for the school district as the assistant to the assistant director of special education. So mom was very involved as well. But so they found the funds and created this program. They hired a woman who really became like a second mother to me, Edith Davis. She later became Edith Ullman. So if I refer to Mrs. Ullman, it's the same person. I stayed in touch with her until just a few years ago when she passed away. She stayed with the schools throughout my entire school career. I was the first student to go from kindergarten through high school and graduate in the Longmont Public Schools with a vision disability. I was not the first to graduate. There were others who had come back from the state school or from other districts where they had been bused in Boulder and some of the nearby towns that had programs for people with low vision. So I was not the first to graduate, but I was the first to go completely through the public school system here in Longmont with a vision disability. And that was not always easy because I was blazing new trails. Those are some of the stories I am planning on sharing with you tonight. But before we get there, I'd like to go into a little bit of the advocacy that my parents did behind the scenes. And I share some of this. As I was preparing this, I thought, okay, so what? I'm telling my story, but there's a lot of so what here. But it occurred to me that many of you watching this may be parents yourself, or grandparents, or friends of parents or families with children that have special needs. And I know one of my friends is a podcaster that's an advocate for a child that they have with special needs. And so I share some of this as encouragement to you all, because you never know where your actions are going to lead. My parents were advocates at the state level here in Colorado with other parents before there were state or federal laws requiring education for people with disabilities. I have a couple of notes here. I did a little bit of research before this tonight, so if you'll allow me just a moment, I'll set some of the timeline here. The Colorado Public Law 94-142 was passed in 1975. Now, to put that into perspective, the first federal law, which was called IDEA, IDEA, that stood for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, did not become federal law until 1990, although it was based on some other federal laws, or at least federal educational, I guess they were laws for people with disabilities. They were not as broad as the IDEA law was in 1990. So to put that in perspective, Colorado was 15 years before that, in 1975. The Americans with Disability Act, which most people think of when they think of laws granting rights to people with disabilities. That law was also not passed until 1990. In July of 1990, it was signed into law. So my parents and the Colorado state school system were really on the forefront of education for people with disabilities, for children with disabilities. And so I bring that up. I think that the so what in all of that is, if you're out there advocating for your children or for people around you, maybe clients. I know I have a couple of friends who are in the healthcare profession or the people care profession. The so what is, you're the voice for people who may not have a voice. Were it not for people like my parents and some of the others at that time, realistically, I might not be here talking to you today. I might be in an institution somewhere. I most likely would not have gotten a public education. I would have probably gotten an education through the state school system, the state school for the disabled, school for the deaf and blind, it's called in Colorado Springs. But it would have been a much different education than I got with Mrs. Ullman. And so back to my growing up as a person with a disability. One of the teasers that I mentioned in my advertising for this was that really, by today's standards, I was bullied as a kid. Not by all my peers. I have some very, very close friends who are still friends today. Some of whom may watch this either live or on the replay. And I thank those friends. Those are the friends that got me through the rough times. But I do remember toward the end of my elementary school period, there were a group of kids, primarily girls, quite honestly. The ones that I can remember were primarily girls, who liked to tease and liked to make fun of the blind guy that had to hold the papers up really close to his eyes and frankly, in their eyes, probably did things kind of weird. But the one thing I wanted to share with you, I've actually used some of this when I've done presentations for schools. Another piece of encouragement to you that may work with people with disabilities or know of children. I do remember something that Mrs. Ullman did to get around the bullying. And I think this is really a wonderful technique for anyone who's being bullied in schools. I know that's a big thing today. And so I share this also as maybe not even just for people with disabilities. What Mrs. Ullman did is she gathered us all in the room, and I do remember this to this day. It was one of the most difficult things in my life. She gathered us all in a room, me and all the taunters, teasers, today we'd call them bullies, and they got to share things that they thought were weird. I honestly don't remember too many of those this many years later, but what I do remember is that Mrs. Ullman then put them in a position, and this is where I think this is really important to think about with any bullying situation. She created an experiment, and this is the piece I've used many times since then, to roughly approximate what I could see. And I've told this to several people, and many of them have gone home and done this little experiment. So if you find yourself, after I explain this to you, doing this on your own as a way to approximate, I'd love to hear about that, either in the comments or direct message me. What she did is she took plastic wrap or saran wrap. At that time, it was roughly 4 to 6 layers of saran wrap that she would put over their eyes. And it's difficult to do because saran wrap, when you start to fold it, it gets crinkled. And so she had to lay it out flat and make sure that it didn't get the creases. Saran wrap is a lot clearer today. I've done this experiment with a friend of mine before going and speaking to his elementary school class. Today it's about 16 layers, 12 to 16 layers of saran wrap. I've also approximated it. It's a little bit easier to do with a Ziploc baggie, Ziploc sandwich bag. You can fold that over, and if you get it to where it's about 4 to 6 layers that you're looking through, that's a little bit easier to get it to not crinkle and fold. So I've started using that in some of my school demonstrations. Roughly 4 to 6 layers of a plastic bag is not exactly what I see, but it approximates it, and it at least allows, in this case when she was doing the experiment with the kids, it allows a child to see approximately the way that I saw at the time. And it works pretty well for adults as well. So once again, if you find yourself doing that now or later on, let me know. And again, if you're watching this live, let me know that you're watching it live with an L in the comments. Or if you're watching on the replay, drop an R just to let me know when you're watching this. So Mrs. Ullman did that little experiment with the kids, and I'd like to say that that cleared everything up right away. It didn't. They still, kids will be kids, but they eventually grew up, and because I stayed with the same peer group throughout my entire school career, they got to where they knew me and knew my idiosyncrasies, and vice versa. I got to where I knew them, and part of her getting us together in the room was to make me aware of the things that they saw as, frankly, kind of strange or kind of weird. But also in the teaser, I mentioned that I went from that was in 5th grade. And at that time, we didn't go to middle school until 7th grade. But in 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade, I believe 8th grade was my first year being elected to student council. And then in 9th grade, I was runner-up for basically the student body president. They called it the head boy. They had a head boy and a head girl position. I was runner-up. I'm still friends with the guy who beat me out. But going from being one of the bullied kids to just a few years later being part of the student governing body was something that I certainly feel very blessed to have accomplished through just a short period of time. Another story that I'll share with you, if you'll allow me for a moment, that I didn't learn until just a few years ago. I was talking with one of my friends that I've been friends with since elementary school. It's kind of amazing that he even stayed friends with me after this, now that I know what I'm about to share. He shared with me just a few years ago that I actually, in one of these taunting raids, that I broke his nose. And Rick, if you end up seeing this on the replay, once again, buddy, sorry. I had no idea at the time. What had happened that he explained to me just a few years ago, and this was part of that same period, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. Kids would walk up behind me and tap me on the shoulder, kind of a kid's version of Ding Dong Ditch, if you will, and then run. So they'd tap me on the shoulder and run away. So by the time I turned around, they were long gone. Well, what happened apparently, according to my friend Rick, is in one of those tirades, of course I was frustrated by it, and so I started swinging whatever I had in my hand to try to catch them before they ran away. Well, apparently one day I had what he and I both figured out was probably either a backpack or a book bag with some heavy large print books in it that I swung around and ended up catching him in the nose. So he ended up, unfortunately, being one of the victims of the bullying escapades. But to his credit, we became pretty good friends through middle school and high school. And as I say, he never shared that story with me until just a few years ago. So that's another example of a true friend and how you, as people who may be around someone with a disability, can encourage others, peers, or other people around that person to support them and allow them to be themselves. So going from there, I ended up, as I mentioned, in middle school, becoming part of the student body leadership group. But I'd also like to say that it was only kids who didn't understand. But at that time, I was really not knowingly at the time, I was blazing a trail that no one had really done before here in the education system in little old rural Colorado. At least at the time it was pretty rural. It's still somewhat rural, but more grown up and more suburban now. But I would always make a point of introducing myself to the teacher and make sure that they knew that I had a vision disability, that I was low vision. By the time I was in middle school, I was starting to use monoculars, which is like a binocular, only just for the one eye, since my right eye is my good eye, as I explained last week, to read the board. And nowadays with a cell phone, you could kind of do the same thing with a cell phone too. But I didn't want the teachers to wonder what this weird kid in the front row was, because I always tended to sit in the front row, was doing. Well, I didn't realize that Mrs. Ullman had already talked to most of the teachers ahead of time. But I remember one teacher in particular. It was 8th grade geography. And I won't mention his name. I don't know if he's still in the area. I haven't had any contact with him in years. But I introduced myself to him, and his response was, well, you better go down and talk to the counselor and get transferred out of this class, because there's no way that you're going to be able to do geography. And I kind of looked at him and I said, well, let's see how it goes. And he said, no. You go down and talk to the counselor and get transferred into another class. So, of course, as a kid, what are you going to do when the teacher tells you to do something? I went down and talked to the counselor, who, of course, knew me pretty well. And he told me to go back to class and he would talk to the teacher. I found out later that Mrs. Ullman had not managed to get to him ahead of time. So I went back to class, and again, I'll demonstrate the importance of peer support. I walked into class, and there was a seat available in the front row. So I plopped my fanny down, and he stopped the class, stopped the lecture that he was doing, and he looked at me and he said, did you go down and talk to the counselor in front of the whole class? And I said, yes, I did. And he said, and? Are they going to transfer you out of here? And I said, no. I said, I'll just sit here and twiddle my thumbs. I said, the counselor will talk to you tomorrow, or before tomorrow, and we'll see where it goes. And he just kind of shrugged and started back up in his lecture in a huff. Well, all of the kids in the classroom applauded. They knew what was coming, and they knew me. So by that time, I had built a peer support group. And, of course, I ended up staying in that class and ended up, as I remember, getting either an A or a B in the class, largely due to Mrs. Ullman's reconfiguring a lot of the assignments to make them possible for me to do. And so going from there, I then went into high school and was involved in band and choir. So pretty much lived a normal childhood and tried to make it as normal as possible. I jokingly say, but this is not far from the truth, that Mrs. Ullman and a black Sharpie marker is what got me through school. That was long before they had photocopiers that would enlarge material. So she enlarged a lot of my worksheets and other things that were not textbooks that could be commercially produced in large print. She would do them by hand. A lot of the music that I did in band, she wrote out note by note. And I still, to this day, I thank God that she was a part of my life, because I don't know how I would have gotten through school without her or someone like her. So I did graduate from high school and went on to college, got a bachelor's degree in college, and went on into the workforce. And I'll go into more of that next week when I discuss living with a disability as an adult. I kind of wanted to separate those two elements a little bit. That's pretty much the stories I wanted to share growing up. By and large, I consider myself to have had a pretty normal childhood. My dad's philosophy, or my parents' philosophy rather, I keep saying my dad, but it really was both of my parents. I don't want to short my mom at all. My parents' philosophy, as they shared with me, and I used this quote in my speech in high school, was he's going to have to compete with sighted people the rest of his life. He might as well start in kindergarten. That was their philosophy. That's the way they raised me. I learned to ride a bike. I didn't necessarily ride it all over town, but I rode it around the neighborhood. I wrestled and did track and field. I did discus and shot put in middle school. Ran the half mile. I couldn't do that today. But that's why when people ask me to tell my story and explain how I do things, this is not new to me. I've grown up this way my whole life. I just do it. How do I do it? A lot of times I don't even think about it because it's not new to me. It's just the way I've always done it. And if you saw my earlier short video that I did with using my cell phone to enlarge the street signs, and I used the same technique for reading bus signs on the buses, I never even really thought about sharing something like that until it kind of hit me one night. And so that's how that came about. I don't really think of these as adaptive ways of doing it. It's just how I've always done it. So that's why I would like to ask, honestly, for you to either put in the comments or direct message me if you have specific things that you'd like me to go into. How do you do this? How do you do that? Because a lot of times I don't even think about it. But I think for tonight, I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to. So once again, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope this has been valuable. If you've gotten value from this, please put value in the comments. And honestly, if you thought it was boring and just, a story that kind of so what, put so what in the comments. I can take that too. And that gives me a little bit of a sense of what's engaging and what's not for my audience. So give me a so what if you just found this as a good bedtime story, but not really anything to it. Please do. So once again, this has been the Karey Carbaugh podcast. If you'd like to be added to my email list so that you're notified of these in advance, I try to do these every Tuesday at approximately 8 p.m. Mountain Time, 7 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Central, and 10 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to try and stick with that schedule unless we need to change it for some reason, but seems to be working out. Excuse me. So if you'd like to be added to my email list, please do direct message me with your email address and I'll be happy to add you. Give me any of your suggestions, comments. If there's things you found valuable, things you didn't find valuable, let me know. And so thank you for joining me. Once again, this has been the Karey Carbaugh Podcast, episode number 8. And until next week, or if I jump on with a short live in the meantime, like I did this last week, have a blessed week and make it a good week. Make it a positive week for those around you. Do something good for somebody else. Thanks so much, and have a great night. Good night for now.